Welcome, everyone. Today, we have an incredibly deep and visually rich study lined up for you. We're going to be walking through a full summary of a really fascinating teaching titled The Apostolic and Prophetic Purpose of the Church. This profound study comes directly from the YouTube channel His Fair Maidens. And hey, if you want to explore the original material in its entirety, you'll find a link to the source right down in the description below. Now, as we go through this today, I want you to mentally transport yourself. Just imagine the oppressive, heavy heat of a vast spiritual desert. Think about that intense feeling of isolation, the blistering winds of hardship, and the sheer exhaustion of just wondering when the journey is ever going to end. A lot of us find ourselves wandering in these very arid landscapes of waiting in our own lives, feeling totally alone. But this study reveals a really powerful narrative. True spiritual foundations are not forged in comfort or luxury. No, they're forged right there, in the absolute harshest parts of the wilderness. So we're going to traverse through those valleys of deep hardship, navigate the silence, and eventually climb those steep, rocky paths toward the mountaintop of restoration. Okay, let's dive into this. Our agenda today maps out exactly how this transformation happens. We'll be looking at 1. Apostolic and prophetic foundations, 2. The furnace of affliction, 3. Navigating hope deferred, 4. Meeting at the mercy seat, 5. Steps to rebuild walls, and finally 6. A final prophetic call. Starting with Section 1, Foundations, Apostolic and Prophetic. The speaker in our source material begins this study by establishing the absolute baseline of what true church foundations actually look like. So, what do these roles actually mean? The crucial point is how the teaching defines them not as lofty titles, but entirely as functions. According to the source, the apostolic function is a lot like a tent maker. It's about being sent out, taking raw territorial ground, establishing government, and building structural frameworks to shelter others. And this is all done with a spirit of immense meekness, not ego. Then you have the prophetic role. Think of this like a plumb line, that simple weight suspended on a string that builders use to make sure a wall is standing perfectly straight. Prophets are described as deep burden bearers who are acutely concerned with alignment and moral integrity. They expose crooked structures. So if you're acting as a burden bearer today, it means deeply feeling the structural leans in your community, empathizing with the brokenness, and mirroring the very heart of God to bring things back into alignment. But there's a really vital distinction we have to make here. Holding on to mere doctrine, like just the letter of the law or rigid religious rules, that only gives you a fraction of the picture. To truly establish an apostolic and prophetic foundation, the teaching argues that you have to deeply understand the ways of God. And these ways, they refer to God's profound wisdom, which you simply cannot memorize from a textbook. It's gained through intense, experiential understanding. Head knowledge and strict rules might build a temporary structure, sure, but heart knowledge, the nuanced ways of God, builds a lasting one. You literally don't learn the ways of God by sitting in a comfortable, climate-controlled classroom. You learn them by getting dust on your feet and walking through the desert. Moving to Section 2, the furnace of affliction, forged in the wilderness. As we descend into this phase of the study, the source explains that being chosen for these foundational roles almost guarantees a trip into this metaphorical fire. The weight of this message is incredibly clear. True leaders are forged in the fire. And honestly, often, they are kept there to serve as an enduring example to everyone else. The speaker heavily references Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, who was called to declare the destruction of Jerusalem, but was also afflicted with deep sorrow so he could genuinely identify with his people's intense suffering. To really drive this home, the speaker shares a deeply moving personal anecdote. She describes her own daughter, who battles severe disorders, as her personal Jerusalem. By watching her daughter's walls break down day after day, the speaker experienced profound bitterness, sorrow, and the exhausting silence of God. It is a really bitter pill to swallow, but the teaching emphasizes that this painful identification with suffering is completely intentional. It's exactly how God strips away our pride to craft a genuine, empathetic intercessor. And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating look at human nature. The speaker turns to the biblical account in Numbers 20, set in the harsh desert of Zin, to outline 3 distinct archetypes of how people react when they're pushed into that furnace. Ask yourself as we go through these, which one have you been? First up, we have Miriam. She represents the carnal Christian, reacting to the wilderness with absolute rebellion and deep-seated bitterness. Next is Aaron, the unbelieving worker. His name literally means light-bringer, yet in the harshness of the journey, he completely succumbs to doubt. Finally, there's Moses, the vexed shepherd. Now, Moses doesn't necessarily lack faith, but he's completely exasperated, burned out, and worn down by the continuous complaining of his flock. It's a pretty sobering realization that all three ultimately miss out on the promised land at that specific moment. Why? Because the extreme heat of the wilderness exposed the deep, hidden resentments they were harboring in their hearts. Section 3. Hope Deferred. Navigating the Silence. Moving right into the emotional core of this study, we address the very heavy, very real reality of feeling completely abandoned. I want you to just let that question sit with you for a second. Why does a loving God feel cruel when prayers go unanswered for years? It's a remarkably provocative question from the source material, and it highlights a deep psychological paradox that so many believers face. The speaker points out, quite impartially, that it's entirely possible to love God deeply on one hand, while silently resenting him on the other because of prolonged suffering. When prayers go unanswered for a decade, when the healing just doesn't come, or the breakthrough is perpetually delayed, that silence doesn't just feel confusing, it can feel actively, intentionally cruel. People find themselves caught in this terrible mental bind, viewing the divine through two violently conflicting lenses, a desperate desire to trust, warring against a deep, unshakable resentment. The source anchors this devastating emotional experience in Proverbs 13:12. When hope is deferred, or just prolonged indefinitely, it literally makes the heart sick. The speaker links this directly to what the 16th century mystic John of the Cross famously called the dark night of the soul. It's this terrifying phase of the spiritual journey where prolonged waiting breeds a heavy, suffocating numbness. You lose your fight, you lose your joy, your trust in the divine feels utterly shattered, and honestly, the mere act of hoping for something good feels like you're just setting yourself up for another, inevitable, devastating disappointment. But this entire journey builds into a structured timeline. The study maps this out to show that the suffering isn't just random. First comes the breakdown, a necessary descent where old, faulty foundations are rooted out and torn down. Then comes the wilderness, that long, grueling, exhausting period of waiting and identifying with suffering. But here is the critical turning point, the appointed time, or kairos favor. Kairos is an ancient Greek word meaning a highly specific, divinely appointed moment in time. The teaching claims that God doesn't just leave you in the ashes indefinitely. At a specific kairos moment, the season shifts abruptly, transitioning you out of the waiting and into the final phase, rebuilding and ascent. Section 4. The Mercy Seat. Meeting on the mountain. This brings us to the turning point of the study, the metaphorical mountaintop, where the speaker was actually inspired by an encounter with an elderly man and his cat named Monterey Jack, who had severe trust issues, to seek God's elevated perspective. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the speaker views the Ark of the Covenant. God tells Moses he will meet him above the mercy seat, exactly between the two cherubim. The teaching uses some prophetic liberty here to describe these two cherubim as representing opposing forces, like mercy on one side and justice on the other. Now, as humans, we generally hate tension, don't we? We want things to be black and white, easily categorized into right and wrong, fair and unfair. But the key takeaway here is that God speaks precisely in the middle of that tension. If you want to hear God's voice and get his blueprint for your life, you have to be willing to meet him in that highly uncomfortable space between your deepest, darkest doubts and your enduring faith. And you have to do it without hiding your true feelings. The study uses biblical figures like Nehemiah and Job to represent this required brokenness. Nehemiah literally sits down and violently weeps over the broken, burned walls of Jerusalem, taking on the historical sins of his people as his own. Job, after losing absolutely everything he holds dear and sitting physically in the ashes of his ruined life, finally sees God's true majesty and repents in dust. Both men had to fully embrace their devastation. The lesson is crystal clear. Before you can receive your divine blueprint to transition out of suffering and into full restoration, you have to first embrace the ashes of your old foundations as an honest intercessor. Moving into Section 5, Rebuilding Walls, Practical Steps. Let's look at the highly actionable application portion of the teaching for anyone navigating their own spiritual wilderness right now. The speaker provides 5 distinct, incredibly practical steps to rebuild your spiritual walls. Step 1 is exceptionally raw and often the hardest. You have to acknowledge your resentment, repent of your bitterness, and actually forgive God for the hardship you've endured. Step 2 is to spend intentional time in worship, which is designed to soften the hard, cynical edges of a wounded heart. Step 3, mentally and spiritually ascend the mountain to get God's specific, customized blueprint for your life, rather than relying on your old plans. Step 4 is where the discipline comes in, practically aligning your life, setting firm, healthy boundaries, and enforcing a discipline of rest. And finally, Step 5, Pray for others in your personal Jerusalem. This means praying for the very people or situations that hurt you, choosing to act as an empowered intercessor rather than a helpless victim. This powerful quote from Peter Taylor Forsyth is front and center in the source material. We do not pray to live, but we live to pray. It highlights such a beautiful paradox. The whole point of surviving the wilderness, enduring the furnace, and rebuilding your walls isn't just so you can go back to being comfortable again. It's so you can lay down your life in intercession for others. Turning your inward, personal pain into outward compassion is the ultimate sign that the furnace has successfully forged a true foundation. Just like Job's fortunes were famously restored only after he prayed for his friends, the very friends who had wrongly accused him, true restoration comes when we turn our pain into prayer for the world. Section 6. Final prophetic call. The Elijah Company. We conclude this study with a summary of an intense prophetic word the speaker originally delivered back in December of 2021. This is an urgent call to action. The message dictates that stepping into this foundational calling today requires a completely new, full consecration. Believers are warned not to lean on their own understanding and certainly not to pursue the great things of God just for personal honor or building a platform. Instead, they are called to be bold, to be fiercely courageous, and to set their faces like flint against coming hardships. The study suggests that those who endure this furnace will emerge as an Elijah company. Why Elijah? Well, because Elijah stood before corrupt Ahab entirely uncompromising and resilient. An Elijah company represents a group of refined workers equipped to carry God's pure, unadulterated light into a severely compromised and dark world, day in and day out. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought derived directly from this study. Think about the entire journey we just traversed together. We saw how Moses, despite all of his faithfulness, allowed his exasperation to get the better of him. He violently struck the rock in the desert instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. So the question for you is this. When you inevitably find yourself in the deep wilderness of affliction, feeling unheard, exhausted, and pushed to your absolute limit, will you strike the rock in bitterness, or will you choose to meet at the mercy seat and speak to it with mercy? Thank you so much for walking through this full summary with me today. It's a massive amount to process, so take your time with it and remember to check out the original source link in the description below.